name's Brian Fowler. I'm a product manager here at Öhlins USA. We're creating a video to show professional installation shops the correct step-by-step process of installing a road track suspension system on a Tesla Model 3. A professional installation is necessary for all Öhlins road track systems to guarantee a proper performing system without any issues or comebacks with the vehicle. By watching this video, the technician can have added confidence that the kit's installed correctly based on Öhlins mounting instructions. The road track system is shipped in one large brown box. Inside that box, there are two separate black boxes that contain the springs and hardware and the 4 shock absorbers and the mounting instructions. Let's go through each box and see what's included and just review the different components. So the top box has the 4 springs. So you've got the front springs here, which are the 47010-35 and the 110 Newton per millimeter for the all-wheel drive kits, and the 47000-39 springs for the rear. Those are 120 Newton per millimeter. And those are also a bit shorter than the front spring. So the best way to tell is the shorter spring goes on the rear of the vehicle. This box also includes the upper spring adapters to fit these flat ground race springs to the OE upper mount. So the upper spring perch with the lip fits to the front springs, and the upper spring perches without the lip fit on the rear springs, like so. The rear spring perches are also included with the kit for the rear, and they go here with the rear springs as well. Those include lock collars and preload adjusters as well that thread on to those height adjusters. The kit also includes spring isolators and the thrust bearings. The nylon thrust bearing here lets the spring rotate while it's being compressed. Those components are included in the box and then recommended in the mounting instruction. So that is pretty much the entire spring package. The bottom box includes the shock absorbers as well as the mounting instructions. So the front shocks are here. They're a large reinforced clevis design with a separate height adjuster from the preload. So you can set your preload on the spring here and then set your height adjustment at this location. So the whole shock absorber threads up and down inside this housing, and that's how you set your ride height. So that's going to be your front shock. Here's the other front shock. There's a part number on each one identifying which one is a driver side and passenger side. They are different. So note the part number and refer to your mounting instruction to determine which one is driver, which one's passenger. The bottom box is also going to include the mounting instruction, the owner's manual, and all the hardware that's necessary to install the kit. There's some stickers that are included as well. And the rear shocks are at the bottom of the box here. These are not driver or passenger side specific, but they do have a length adjuster here when you're trying to adjust the length of the shock to accommodate the ride height that you choose with the height adjusters. So we'll set those here. The bottom box also includes the bellows for the rear shocks, the larger of the two, and then the bellows for the front shock absorbers as well. And last but not least, the spanner wrenches to adjust your spring preload and your ride height. So this is all of the components that are included in the package. And now we can move on to the installation steps. Before bringing the vehicle onto the lift to perform the installation, it's good to take a preliminary measurement of the ride height of the car. We'll take our tape measure and measure from the bottom of the rim vertically to the edge of the fender at the front and the rear. Just make those notes so you can compare them after the kit's installed to make sure the ride height is what the customer prefers. So here we are at the front suspension. We've got the hood open. We're accessing the front trunk. We've got multiple hardware locations that hold the frunk into place. There's hardware at the bottom of the frunk here. There's hardware just below this panel that covers the latch. And there's hardware just below this access panel to the battery. So once you remove the panel here, there's hardware here and here, here, below the frunk, and then below the latch. By removing this panel, you'll have access to the front suspension upper mount location. We can loosen those and remove the coilover. So once the panels are removed, you gain access to 4 bolts that hold this upper mount in place. The bolts here, underneath the washer reservoir here, and then on the back corner here as well. We're going to hold off on removing these bolts until after we remove the wheel, you gain access to the coilover. So now we've got the car up on the lift, and we have to remove the wheel to gain access to this factory spring and shock to remove that. So we're going to go ahead and dig into this. Teslas have a lug nut cover here, a static cover that we'll have to remove with this tool to pop it off. Once that's removed, there's a 21 millimeter lug nuts that hold the wheel on. So we'll begin to remove those lug nuts and take the wheel off and get in there and start removing the factory shocks. Okay, so the next steps, we'll remove the upper bolt that secures the ball joint to the bearing carrier. We'll remove the nut that secures the sway bar link to the shock absorber, and the lower bolt that secures the shock absorber to the lower control arm. And then finally, we'll get the ABS sensor out of the way by unclipping it from the bearing carrier and the upper control arm so it doesn't get damaged while we remove the shock. So now it's time to remove these 4 bolts that secure the upper A-arm assembly to the chassis. They're 13 and 15 millimeter. We'll remove those. It's a good chance to maybe have a friend that holds it up into place while you're removing them. And then we'll move it over into this space here so we can remove the upper mount bolts from the shock mount, and then we're ready to remove it from the vehicle. So after the 3 bolts are removed from the upper shock mount, we're going to move this upper control arm bracket back into place here, and then just run some of the hardware back in temporarily just to hold it there while we take the spring and shock out. We'll put one there, and we'll set one back here just for a few minutes while we remove that. All right, so now we've loosened the 3 bolts that secure the spring and shock to this upper control arm bracket. We've lifted the car back up, and now we want to remove the spring and shock from the fender well. We took an extra step and used the bungee cord to hold this carrier up to keep tension off of the brake line, just to keep that safe. So now we can take this shock, twist it around here, get good access. And then let it drop down, watch your ABS sensor, and then it'll just come right out. All right, so now we've removed the spring and shock and upper mount from the car, and it's time to remove this OE mount to reuse it with the Road and Track kit. Just to reiterate, this step should be performed by a professional shop. The spring needs to be compressed before the upper mount's removed. Okay, so now that we've removed the factory top mount from the factory shock absorber, we can take this part and begin assembling the front coilover kit. The OE top mount, if your vehicle has some miles on it, you just want to inspect it and see if there's any wear, see if anything stands out to you that maybe you just need to replace it with a brand new unit. If not, then we can reuse it and move ahead here. For the Road and Track kit, you do reuse the OE rubber top isolator, so that is reused. So you install it on the OE mount, and then the spring adapter will set against that, and then that assembly will set aside, and we'll install it in just a second. So yeah, here's the OE, or the Öhlins Road Track front shock. You've got the bump stop, you've got an external spacer above that, and then the bump stop washer at the top. That's how it comes assembled. The upper damping adjuster is also assembled on the unit like so. So you'll just remove it and set it aside. And the first item you want to install is the dust boot. So we'll take that and install it like so. The next piece is the nylon thrust washer. So that goes at the base of the spring. So what we'll do is, what I'd like to do is turn the spring perch down nearly all the way to the bottom, and we will install this nylon thrust washer. So now we'll install the spring on top of the thrust washer. The next step is we will install the spacer on the top pin. It spaces the OE mount correctly. Once we get this OE mount assembly, we will make sure that we have our rubber spacer on the bottom of our adapter. So we've got Öhlins rubber isolator on the bottom, Öhlins Road Track adapter, factory rubber isolator here, and then the OE top mount. So this goes together as an assembly on top of that spacer, like so. Once you have all this assembled, you can take our 14 millimeter M10 top nut, thread it on, and you can tighten it pretty much just hand tight for now. You can hold the shaft with your fingers here, and you can just run this down and tighten it. Give just a second to do that. Once that's hand tight, we can go and torque it to the torque setting recommended in the mounting instructions. So we will hold the nut. We've taken a socket and used vice grips to go in and hold that nut steady with this tool. Now we have a 5 millimeter extended 3/8 socket with a torque wrench. So we'll go in here, and then now we will tighten this down. Yep, there we go. There we go. Now that's tightened to the spec and the mounting instructions. Okay. If you need more room to install the 5 millimeter hex into the top pin, you can actually take a 2.5 millimeter hex and run it and engage the adjuster that's inside the shaft, and you can turn it down a few extra turns. This gives you extra room and better engagement with that top pin. So that was already ran down most of the way, so there's not an issue with that. The next step is going to be to preload the spring. So in the mounting instructions, you'll find the preload recommendation. This one, it's 2 millimeter for this road and track spring. So we'll run the spring perch up to the spring, right where it starts to engage. Now this spring has a 200 millimeter free length. So if you measure the spring, you're going to measure that, yes, the spring's exactly 200 millimeters long. Öhlins recommends a 2 millimeter preload on that spring. So we're going to take this spring perch and we're going to turn it. It's usually about 1.5 turns. So we'll take this and turn it down about 1.5 turns, and then remeasure this spring. Okay, we're going to do one more turn. Okay, and that's 198 millimeters. So this spring is preloaded 2 millimeters. It's a 200 millimeter spring, compressed 2 millimeters to 198 millimeters. Once that's in place, we're going to run our lock ring up, and we're going to lock that into place here. And without moving your spring perch. So here we go. Now that's tight. Okay, so now that this spring is preloaded correctly, then we can make our height adjustment on the vehicle with this height adjuster. So this perch, this lower clevis can be moved up or down on the shock body, and that changes the length of the shock, and that's what sets your ride height. So you can set this in a range that's specified in the mounting instructions. We're going to choose a setting that's kind of right in the middle to give the recommended ride height. So we're going to measure it from the top of this perch here all the way to the top of the spring. Okay, yep, that's the recommendation for the setting that we prefer. Again, if you want something different, look at the mounting instruction. It gives a range, and you can choose the setting that complements the ride quality that you prefer. So once that's set, which it's already preset, what we can do is install the upper damping adjuster. So the adjuster unit just threads on to the tip of the top pin on the shock. Take this 14mm wrench and tighten that down, like so. And then take a 2mm Allen, and we will tighten this extension to the Allen. Now on a Model 3, this extender allows you to access the adjuster from above the plastic paneling in the trunk. So you can open the trunk, access the adjuster without having to remove the plastic paneling. So we'll tighten that down, like so. Yeah, I believe that's it. You've got the adjuster here. At the top, OE mount, isolator, spring adapter, the Öhlins rubber isolator, the spring compressed at 2mm, the nylon thrust washer at the base of the spring, and then setting your height adjuster based on the ride height that you prefer, or specifically in what's specified in the mounting instructions. So that's the full assembly. Now we can go install it on the vehicle. So now we're going to remove this upper control arm assembly. We have these bolts holding it up temporarily. We're going to remove those. And we're going to take out this upper control arm assembly here. Okay. Now we can take this and install it on our Öhlins coilover and reinstall the package. So now we've got our upper control arm assembly and the Öhlins coilover assembly here. So we're going to marry those together at the upper shock mount. We'll take our 3 nuts, run these down. Get those snug, and then we'll torque these to the torque spec recommended by Tesla for the OE mount. So we have that setting here. Okay, got one down. Okay, all right, those are torqued to spec. Now the whole assembly is ready to be installed on the car. Now that we have it fully assembled, we can install it in the fender well. Take note that the sway bar tab faces forward toward the front of the car. This flat side of the clevis also faces forward, so that's a good indication you have it correctly oriented before you install it. So what you want to do is take the lower clevis and just set it on the control arm. Be very careful not to make contact with the fender. Like this, and just set it in there temporarily until you can lower the car, just like that. And now we can move on to the next step. So with this next step, it's nice to have a friend to hold the upper control arm assembly and coilover into position while you tighten these 4 bolts at the top. These are the same 4 bolts that we loosened previously. So you've got one here, here, underneath the washer reservoir, and back behind the window cowling here. So refer to the Tesla workshop manual to tighten these bolts to spec. Once you got those into position and tightened, we can go back under the fender well and tighten the remaining bolts and wrap up the installation of this front axle. Okay, so the next steps are going to be reinstalling the upper control arm to the bearing carrier here at this ball joint, reinstalling the nut and bolt that secured the shock absorber to the lower control arm, and then finally the nut that secures the sway bar link to the shock absorber. And we'll also take a minute and reattach the ABS sensor harness to the carrier and the control arm as well. Okay, so when tightening this lower bolt that secures the coilover to the lower control arm, it's ideal to tighten that bolt at static ride height instead of at full droop. It's a rubber bushing, so it's going to twist as the suspension comes up at that static ride height, so it will always be bound up and not ideal. So ideally, when the car is on the ground, that's when you get under the vehicle with the torque wrench and tighten it to the recommended torque setting. So now that the front coilover is installed, you can see here that the adjuster for the damper is at the top of the shock, and it protrudes past the frunk liner. So what we're going to do is drill a hole in the frunk liner to gain access to this knob so they can be easily adjusted with the hood popped. Okay, so now we're ready to mark our hole for the adjuster on the front shocks into the frunk liner. What we're going to do is use this line here as a reference and measure forward on the vehicle 30 millimeters and just mark a spot 30 millimeters in front of that. Then we're going to make our adjustment to 40 millimeters. We're going to reference this line here. So we're going to go out 40 millimeters from this line and make a note, about that distance to the outside of the vehicle here. So this is going to be the point where we drill our 9 millimeter hole. Go ahead and get your drill. There. And that's all. We'll do that on the driver and passenger side. We're ready to reinstall the liner. Okay, so now we reinstall the front liner. Be careful. Get all your clips back into place. As you're lowering it back down, just get the adjuster to poke through the hole that you just drilled. Once that settles into place, now you can take the adjustment knob that comes with the kit and install it on the top of the extension cable here. And then install the screw that secures the knob, like so. Make sure that the adjuster, you feel the defined clicks between each adjustment. And then you can continue to install all the liners in the front and complete the front installation. So now the front's complete. We've reinstalled the wheel, torqued the lug nuts down to spec. Now we can move on to the rear and get that completed. Okay, so now we're moving on to the rear suspension. We've went ahead and removed the wheel. Step one is to remove this plastic paneling below the lower rear control arm. So there's a 10 millimeter bolt that secures it in place. We'll just remove that, and then the panel just slips off. So next step, we're going to support the suspension from below and remove the 2 bolts that secure the upper shock mount to the body. Those are 15 millimeter. Okay. Once those are removed, we can move on to the next step. So now we're going to remove the rear lower shock mount bolt. It's 21 millimeter hex. Okay, let's remove the OE shock. We're going to be careful just not to hit the fender here. Just take the lower part of the shock and go back into the corner of the fender well and just drop the front mount down. Just be careful not to make contact with the edge of your fender. And just pull the mount out like so. Okay, next step, we're going to remove the bolt that secures the lower control arm to the bearing carrier. It's a 21 millimeter bolt. So we'll move in here and just remove it with the nut. You may need to use a pry bar just to take some of the forces off of that bolt as we remove it from the bearing here. That's it. Okay, so now let's remove the rear spring. We'll take the support out of the way and let this spring extend down with that lower control arm. So our spring still has tension on it with the lower control arm. So we've got a tech tip here. Reinstall your hardware here, and we can use the pry bar to put some more tension on this arm, pull it down, and relieve all the pressure on the spring, and it'll slip right out. So now we've got the OE rear shock and OE rear spring removed from the vehicle. Let's prep the road and track kit and get it ready to install. First step is to remove the rear upper shock mount from the shock. If you've got a power tool, it's a lot easier to remove this piece. We will not be reusing that upper nut, so we'll go ahead and remove this mount, set the shock aside. And we will remove the dust boot and the bump stop the OE parts from that. Take a minute and inspect the OE mount. Make sure that the rubber inside the mount is still in good condition. You can reuse it. This one looks great, so we'll go ahead and take the Road Track rear shock and install the mount to the top. We'll align the Öhlins logo with the studs here and install our M10 top nut. We'll just get that hand tight for now. We'll come back later and torque it down with the torque wrench. So next step is going to be measuring the shock length to make sure that it matches the recommendation in the mounting instructions. Just take a tape measure here, measure that out. Just refer to the mounting instructions to get the correct length. This one is correct. So we'll move on to installing the dust boot. So since this is an upside down shock, shaft side down, we'll install the dust boot on the bottom of the shock absorber, covering up the shaft. Just pull this over the lower bushing. All right, slide that over the body of the shock. Pull the boot over the adjuster and turn this adjuster all the way closed, so all the way righty-tighty until it's in the stiffest position. That's where we'll know, it's a good indication of where to cinch this boot down with the zip tie. So we'll take our zip tie, we'll run it around, secure the base of the boot here. Okay, and then we'll tighten this bottom boot right at the base of the body of the shock. Like so. Okay, so now that's complete and ready to install, and then we'll move on to assembling the rear spring assembly. So with the OE rear spring, we're going to remove and reuse the upper isolator. So we'll take that off and we'll install it on the top of our spring adapter here. And at the base of the spring adapter, we're going to install the rubber washer, the base of that. And then we'll just set this whole assembly on the top of our spring, like so. And now we will move to assemble the spring preloader. So we'll take our lock ring and thread it onto the threaded base. Run it about halfway down, and then install our spring preloader, lower spring perch. The mounting instruction gives a recommendation based on the model of if it's a Model 3 or Model Y. This one, I have the settings based on the mounting instructions here. So we're going to measure that position. And get it locked into place. We'll use our spanner wrenches that are included with the kit. Lock this down, like so. And then we'll use the nylon thrust washer here that the spring will set on. That will allow the spring to, as it compresses, to actually twist and not bind, so having a noise-free operation. That goes at the base of the spring like so. That completes the entire Road Track spring assembly, and then we've got the shock assembled here, and we are ready to install the product. Let's head over to the vise, and we'll torque down that top nut on the mount, and we're ready to go. Okay, so now we're going to torque the top pin nut. The torque spec is in the mounting instructions. Please refer to that. We're holding the shock lightly in a vise with the rubber grips. So we're going to torque those down to spec here. Okay. After that's torqued, take our the rubber cover from Tesla and reattach it to the top. And now the shock's ready to install in the car. Okay, so now we're going to install the rear spring assembly. We're going to take our pry bar again and just pull down on that lower control arm to give us room to insert this whole assembly at one time. It'd be very straightforward. So here we go. And that's it. Okay, so let's install the rear shock. Just be careful not to hit the fender. Okay, and we're going to leave that lower bolt loose so we can easily slip this lower control arm onto the lower ball joint. Okay, so we just want to touch on adjusting the rear ride height. The front ride height adjustment is very straightforward. You simply lengthen or shorten the shock absorber to change the ride height. Since the rear is a divorced setup where the spring is separate than the shock, then there's an extra step involved. So if you want to lower the car a bit more than what's recommended, you would simply just reduce the spring preload. So you would lower the preload adjuster on the lower spring perch down to the height that you prefer. By doing that, you're reducing preload on the spring, and the spring can become loose at full droop. To accommodate that, you simply shorten the length of the shock absorber to pull the unsprung mass up and keep tension on that spring at full droop so it will not fall out and maintain safety of the vehicle. So again, just reducing spring preload on the spring to lower the ride height down, and then shortening the shock to keep preload on that spring to keep the car safe when the car is at full droop, when it's on a lift or hitting a bump in the road. Now we're going to raise the lower control arm to put it in position to install the lower control arm bolt through the bearing carrier. So now we're going to install the lower control arm bolt that secures the arm to the bearing carrier, where it's going to pull the carrier down, slip it in like so, and start our nut on the other side here. And while we're down in this location, we'll torque it to spec along with the bolt that secures the shock to the lower control arm. So when adjusting the rear shock clicker setting, the knob is actually at the bottom of the shock absorber instead of at the top, since this is an inverted shaft down arrangement. The front is shaft up, so the adjuster is underneath the hood. That one's very straightforward. You turn the knob clockwise to stiffen the shock, and you turn it counterclockwise to loosen or soften the shock absorber. Since this knob is at the bottom of the shock, then it can be a little bit confusing. So when making the adjustment, thinking about turning the knob to close the bleed, you actually turn it clockwise up the shock absorber this way. So you're turning it up to close it, and then you're turning it counterclockwise down to loosen and soften the shock absorber. So in this case, we're going to turn the knob all the way closed, so all the way clockwise up until it stops clicking, and that's 0 clicks, that's full stiff. And then we're going to open it up 15 clicks, and that's going to be where we're going to start the settings for the street. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, counterclockwise, and that's going to be our starting setting for this car. Okay, so now let's re-secure the top bolts that hold the upper shock mount to the body. All right, now we're going to reattach this aero panel that goes under the lower control arm. This 10 millimeter screw secures it. Okay, that wraps up the rear suspension installation. We'll get the wheel back on, torque it to spec, get the car back on the ground and measure the ride height, and we're good to go to the alignment shop. So now that the Road Track suspension system's installed, we recommend going for a short test drive just to let the suspension settle into place. Come back into the shop and just measure from the bottom of the rim to the top of the fender. Take that measurement and compare it to the OE ride height to make sure that the drop is to what the customer prefers. From there, if you need to make adjustments, you can do so, and then it's time to take it to the alignment shop to have the car realigned and ready to give back to the customer. We hope you found this video helpful for installing an Öhlins Road Track system on a Tesla Model 3. Please contact us with any questions, and thank you again for choosing Öhlins.